in RAM at any given time, because the other 90 are down here. The user's not going to be able to see them, so why bother keeping them in memory? So if I give you that insight, why are we apparently using this trick? What's the motivation? Yeah? Exactly. It all boils down to memory usage and memory management. So to your comment earlier about really the spirit of keeping memory usage low, you could absolutely just allocate 100 cells for 100 items. And frankly, the user's probably not going to notice any latency when scrolling through them, because 100 is not that big. But suppose for Evil Hangman, you decided to make an application that displays all 100,000 plus words at once, and you scroll through that, then you probably will, depending on the hardware, start to notice some latency, because there's so much RAM being taken up by all of those rows, and it's completely unnecessary. Of the 100,000, you can only see maybe 10 of them at once, so you only need to have 10 actually resident in memory at a time. So this queue is meant to be a performance optimization. So if you've ever used an iOS application that starts to feel very laggy for some reason, it's probably because they were trying to do too much, and potentially some of that work was unnecessary, as might be the case here. So this is illustrative of that kind of design paradigm, especially as your data sets get larger and larger. OK, let's not dwell too much on the other methods, but happy to take questions if they arise or are on your minds now. All right, so that just leaves us with one last class, the detail view controller. So this guy, if I go to the .h file, looks pretty uninteresting, except for the fact that he's got a UI label and he's got a detail item. I also see mention of IB outlet. What is that again? What's an IB outlet? OK, good. So it's a reference to something that's declared in the nib. So it's a means of my code talking to my drag and drop interface. And in this case, the thing in question is a UI label. So how can I pull up Interface Builder and see that interface? What file do I want to click next to follow this trail of breadcrumbs? Yeah, so detail view controller.nib. And if I look there, looks like indeed someone has just dragged and dropped a UI label. I know that because I can see its description down over here. And when in doubt, too, if I go to the right-hand panel and open that up and notice that I'm on the identity inspector, Xcode has a habit of dumbing things down by saying label hyphen detail view controller ... when really that's not all that interesting programmatically. You want to know what type of object is that really. So in the identity inspector, which you can see at top right, you can see that, oh, the thing I've just clicked is actually an instance of UI label. That is what I have dragged and dropped. And again, that's the connection between code and the drag and drop interface here. So let's answer just one last question before we put this template aside. How do we somehow pass control off from the master view controller to the detail view controller? How do we make that transition? We haven't looked at the code yet per se, but where would you look if you wanted to answer that question? How does clicking on a cell lead to a state transition? What file should we look at? OK, so we want to look at the method that's called when it's actually clicked. And how can I chase down that answer?
We passed in a selector into the constructor of one of the rows.
OK.
We found the master view controller.m.
OK.
We did a control F for selector.
Selector. OK, so there's a selector for insert new object. We saw that before. Only one match. OK, so let's see. If I scroll down here, cell for row, can edit row at index path, table view commit editing style. That doesn't sound right. Oh, this one, interesting. And that's exactly right. What Peter proposed is that presumably there's some method that's defined, maybe in that protocol we saw at the very beginning of the story, that is what's called when a user clicks on the row. And indeed, that's the case. This is a common paradigm, clicking on the row in a table. So Apple went ahead and implemented that base functionality for us. So if we want to listen for that key press on one of those rows, we apparently just have to implement a method called table view did select row at index path. So what's going on in there? Well, notice first it takes two arguments. The first is a table view. So that's what table view did the user click on. Maybe there's multiple ones on the screen. And what, again, to be clear, is an index path? Section and a row number. So it's going to be like 0, comma something for the 0th section, 0 index, and the actual row number. All right, so what are we doing here? We again seem to be doing what's generally called lazy loading. if the detail view controller does not yet exist, if it's nil, what do we actually do? We allocate it by calling detail view controller alloc. We initialize it with nib name, detail view controller. Notice when you call this method, you don't say .xib. Bundle is just referring to what folder is it in. We just say nil because it's in the default. Everything is organized at this top level. And so once these lines of code have executed, we now have a pointer to an object of type detail view controller. So we've got the thing in memory now. We just have to transition from the master to the detail. So what am I going to do next? NSDate object object. So just to be clear, what is this next line of code doing? On the right-hand side, we have what type of object? What is underscore objects? An NS mutable array. So if we index into it at a current row, that's going to return an object of what type, apparently? An NSDate. And on the left-hand side, we are allocating what? Let's a little pop quiz here. A pointer, good, to an object of type NSDate. So we're not allocating an NSDate. We're allocating a pointer to an NSDate. So it's just 64 bits, most likely, not the full-fledged object. Next, we do self.detailViewController. Detail view controller. What is self.detailViewController? Where did we see that before? So it's a property that we declared earlier. And .detailItem, well, what's detailItem? It's going to be set to the object. Where did I see detailItem? If I go to detailViewController.h, detailItem was apparently a property that I stored here. It's a type ID. What does ID mean? Any object. It's a pointer that could be nil, but it's a pointer to any object. So this is just a generic way. We could have been more explicit and stored NSDates. Whoever wrote this template decided to just genericize it a bit. So we're storing something of type ID there. So lastly, in this line, we call pushViewController animated yes. So the fact that it slides from left to right, as we can see, is the result of the following. Notice the sexy left to right behavior like that. But if I instead change the Boolean yes to Boolean no, stop the current running instance and rerun, and now go ahead and +++, click here, much less elegant. Right? That's what makes Apple devices Apple, the sexy little slides back and forth. All right. Whew. Questions? OK, so you may never again use a master detail view controller template, and that's fine. The goal of this was not to walk through just templates that Apple hands to us, but rather a number of the design paradigms that they're leveraging as a result of this so that you can either start with something like this or something simpler, like the simple single view application, and begin to wire things together in the same way. And what this is particularly illustrative of is wiring stuff together, not using interface builder and dragging and dropping blue lines, but writing much more code and doing it manually and precisely. IB outlet in this guy over here? Good question. So detailed description item. For some reason, the developer who wrote this template seems to have gotten bored with actually doing the wiring, and rather the coding, and decided to wire it up. So we can go to the nib file for detail view controller, and if I control click on this thing, we will see that detailed description label is wired to file's owner. And who is the owner of this file, apparently? The controller, the detail view controller, because recall, that's the guy that initialized the nib with nib name. So he is the file's owner because he's the guy that called this nib file to life. So that was the one instance of dragging and dropping. Everything else in the master was done in code.
Okay, so that's why it's weak.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I missed that part of the question. Yes, so if we go into detail view controller, we have seen a slightly different feature here. These attributes associated with properties. The reason that this here is weak is that we do not want the, what's the best way to say this? This property in the detail view controller is pointing to an object that doesn't need to be kept around, particularly if the detail view controller, once it goes out of scope, as by hitting the back button, disappears from memory. We don't want to have a strong reference to the detail description label, lest that blue line keep the detail view controller in memory unnecessarily long. So and this really boils down, the motivation for this is because the detail view controller is coming and going, we want iOS to be able to reclaim that memory, and so we don't hang on to, in a strong way, these blue lines. And that's the first instance I think we've actually seen of that use of weak for that reason. Good question. All right, why don't we go ahead and take our 5-minute break here. We'll come back and start building something from scratch. And we're back. So recall that there's been a checkbox that we haven't checked thus far because we've been using nibs instead. And nibs are a deliberate design decision because they've given us much more low-level